Today we're actually going to jump off a little bit from that prior conversation. We're going to continue it, and we're actually going to talk about a kind of a methodology that comes from lean startup methodology. And this is very specifically about how to get to innovation. So we just very quickly, so just first by way of acknowledgement, so this particular presentation, and in fact my entire lean startup series, is actually a series of 5 different talks. This is something I developed while I was working at a university incubator at Queen's University. So over a period of about 4 years, I was working with Kingston and the rest of Eastern Ontario, was able to coach about 300 startup businesses. So took some of the insights from the lean startup community, packaged them, and the idea was to really give people a very quick introduction into lean startup methodology. So I will send you the link to this particular talk. These slides will also be available for distribution. If you were to click on this little picture of this little slide, this has basically all the instructions and recipe kit you could need to basically deliver an innovation from a raw idea into something that scales into hopefully a world-changing solution for people. So here's what we're going to do today. I'm going to give you a very, very quick review of the lean startup conversation we had. That would have been in May, I believe. And then we're going to talk about these special creatures, these kinds of end users that I'm going to reference constantly that we call early adopters. So we're going to take a slightly anthropological field study, understand how to identify an early adopter based on their habitats and their behaviors. Then we're going to talk about, once we've identified early adopter, it's a type of end user, and we're going to talk about how to approach them. So it turns out that innovation and invention are really not the same thing, right? And innovation use knowledge to create value. That means you may not have invented anything at all. You may have just simply used what was already known in a novel way to create novel value. And to do that, there has to be a user. There has to be somebody to whom this value accrues. Sometimes that can be yourself. Encourage people to make that about others as much as possible. So I'm going to introduce you to a methodology, and the methodology I'm going to build this on is to do with value chain analysis. So this is something that actually comes out of the microeconomics world and the manufacturing world, but an extraordinarily valuable way of thinking about where to spot innovations and how to making them come true. And then we're just going to talk about this thing, this MVP, this minimum viable product, how it's popularly understood, what it actually is, and why it's a really useful intellectual framework for attempting to innovate. So let's just jump in. What we would have learned last time. So I'm going to give you lean methodology for startups in 2 slides. So this was the way we understand innovation traditionally. This is the way we understand startup businesses. So the idea is that you would build this product, you would show the, and you'd set a price for it, and then you'd start soliciting customers or end users to use your innovation. And then you'd find out if that worked. So there was a problem with this model. This is the write a business plan and launch a business model, because all the costs, the big costs, are up front, and all the uncertainty. So all you're doing really is amplifying risk. So here's the big secret of lean startups. Lean startup says, okay, yeah, you got to do those things, but just do it all backwards, right? So start with building the customer or the end user, right? And then try to solicit their help, and then for getting that help, for creating a solution for them, and then figure out a way, a product or a new process or a new service that actually solves the problem. And then you're going to iterate through steps 1 through 4 a number of times, perhaps, and then eventually you'll invest the kind of dollars and time it takes to build a product. And is you basically just invert these curves, right? So you're actually minimizing the amount of forward risk. The uncertainty curve, the blue curve, is because end users, people, are always the most uncertain thing in any innovation context. It turns out that a technology or a new service or some new way of doing things, your worries. The biggest worry usually is getting some end user to actually adopt that. So what you're really trying to do here is you're trying to get the end user to co-invent the product, service, or new way of doing things that you're trying to develop. The other thing that we introduced last time was this idea of the value chain. So are ubiquitous in microeconomic discourse. They're extraordinarily valuable, and all it basically says is that your experience of some product or some service, in this case we'll say a minivan with cup holders, is the consequence of many things, and each of those things or they can also take away value as well. But it's the addition of all these things. So if you're drinking coffee in a minivan as you're driving down the road, your experience of that can be enhanced by the fact of having cup holders. But it also depends on other things like having windows, so the wind isn't blowing in the face, having an enclosure, right, so that you feel safe, system so that not every pothole causes you to spill your coffee. And when you have this kind of a systematic way of understanding where value comes from, this gives you a nice way to sort of figure out exactly which steps you may or may not be interrupting. So we'll go back to that. Okay. We're getting towards the end of what we did in Lean Startup. Was this idea of not having a business plan, but having a model for what the startup or what the innovation was supposed to do. And we introduced this idea of a business model canvas, and then I gave you a slightly more useful one called a lean model canvas. And the lean model canvas had 9, and these assumptions actually would add up to a traditional business plan.
That's it.
But what I was getting to with the canvas is that you can get the core assumptions, the core hypotheses of making innovation work down to one single page. And your job as an innovator or as an entrepreneur trying to change anything sustainably and scalably really is to test the assumptions in each of these 9 boxes. And basically, once you've failed to falsify a hypothesis in all 9, you've actually got what is basically a fulsome business model. This is a very rapid way to iterate through this idea might work. The resource explains exactly what all these boxes do. We'll actually revisit these a little bit today. And the last idea was that there are sort of 5 phases of going through these 9 assumptions. And there's a kind of a normal order of assumptions you would want to validate in order to backwards the way we were meant to do, right? And it has to do with starting with these problem spaces and these end users and working with them. That's really our focus today. We're really talking about steps 1 through 2 and with half of step 3. That's really our focus today. So adds up to, and we'll go back to this as well. I gave a kind of a facile, mental model here of identifying an end user, the blue-faced person who has something they're trying to do. They're trying to stretch their frown into a smile. You think you can do better. You assess the value. Would you like to have a smile? Yes. How much would you pay to have a smile? I'd pay a nickel. And then you take the nickel to stretch their face into a smile. And you ask them how that was, and they say it was worth a nickel, but after a while your hands hurt, and by the way, that's really inconvenient, so maybe you tape their face into a smile and so forth. Way of identifying that the process is always iterative, right? When you want to change the way value is created, usually you want to start with very, very simple tests, and these tests really are what the minimum viable product are. You're establishing tests that you're using to try and falsify your hypothesis of supposed to work. And the trick, the art of innovation is finding the fastest, lowest cost test that you can bring to bear to test your value assumption, right? And by working through that end user uncertainty very quickly, you're actually moving far further in the innovation cycle than if you just go into the garage, disappear for a couple of years to build the perfect face stretching machine, which you find out later nobody wants, and now you've mortgaged the house in order to do it. That's bad. Okay, so today's item is going to basically talk about sort of this part of the cycle, the deep shaded color stuff here. So let's have a quick little conversation about these creatures called early adopters. So end users, right? If we're going to have innovation, we want it to benefit someone. In research, most of our innovations are not inventions. Most usually have to do with processes. Often, the way something gets done, right? And for that to have any impact, we have to do it if it is about our research, but then we publish, and what we're really looking for is for other people to take that up, right? Hopefully we found a better way to do it. The way we can approach people that's going to make them, hopefully help us develop the better way of doing things, but also is more likely to bring them along, right, to be early adopters in these things. So what is an early adopter? I really like the first answer. This comes from Justin Wilcox, a person who kind of divined this 5-step method of working through a canvas to validate a business idea. But really, end users are identified because they're already trying to solve the problem at hand, right? So the person wearing the wax lips because they wanted their frowny face to be a smiley face, they're already trying to solve the problem. They're trying to get things done. And my definition is that this end user is motivated to work with you to solve the problem. And to be specific, they're motivated enough to put up with all the headaches of me physically stretching their face into a smile with my hands, or with taping their face into a smile, or whatever it is that I'm doing. It's iterative. The first solutions are not necessarily amazing. And an early adopter is the kind of end user who's going to stick with you through the process of getting from adequate to amazing. And then, of course, an early end user is another common definition. So this idea, early adopter, actually comes out of the marketing world. So this was about 20 years now. A marketing analyst named Jeffrey Moore got very interested in how products succeed in the technology marketplace. So he was interested in things like portable CD players, old school tech at the time that was doing quite well. But what he wanted to understand is, how do you go from selling a few units to selling many millions? And what he realized is, in this case, these were customers he was interested in. Customers are not all the same. And so he did some psychological profiles, interviewed them, and he found out that there's a kind of a normal distribution of customer personas or customer psychologies. And what turns out to be critically important are those who are called early adopters. So there is a tiny slice at the left tail that are innovators. The problem is that they don't want someone else solving their problem. They want to solve their own problems. And if you come to them with a solution, typically what they want is, well, why don't you leave it with me, let me get under the hood, and then I'll change it, the way I want to change it. Typically they want things for free. Typically they come in with their own solutions. Typically they're you, right? And you would be your own worst customer. So these customers will bankrupt you, right? What will happen is you will approach them to develop a solution, and they will spend so much time tweaking with it, you'll never go anywhere. The early adopter this is exactly who you want to engage with as an end user. So when you develop a new process for collecting data in the lab, you want to figure out who is an early adopter, because everybody else is the wrong person to try and influence, right, to come along with you for that journey. The early adopter to solve the problem. They are interested in getting problems solved, and they do not care who invented the solution, right? The solution doesn't have to even exist. They're not trying to copy someone else who has already solved the problem. They're just focused on solving the problem itself. And with these people, everybody else is going to bankrupt you, by the way. The early majority customer is someone who pays attention to what early adopters are doing. And they will follow the early adopter if they see the early adopter's problems are getting solved. So these are, this is pretty typical when you see in a neighborhood a certain kind of vehicle. And then all of a sudden, 2 or 3 people in the same neighborhood have bought the same vehicle, right? So one of them was an early adopter, right? They were trying to solve a certain problem. I need a station wagon that's, plug-in hybrid, needs to have a little bit of cargo space, et cetera, et cetera. It solves their problem. The neighbor sees that it solved the problem, and then they buy it. That is an early majority customer. Late majority customers are mostly doing things because other people are doing them, right? So, in my household, a good example might be the really fancy television, right? So I paused to buy one, and then my television broke, and I was like, okay, so try to find a not high resolution television now, right? So you get one. If the ultra high definition television people had come to me, they would have gone broke, right? Because I wasn't going to do it until basically I was forced into it. A laggard. A laggard is usually almost a Luddite, right? It's like, I like things the way they are and I don't want to change, right? And, we hear that in academia from time to time. So all these people are fine people. There's nothing wrong with being an early majority or laggard or late majority, except for when it's time to innovate. Right? Innovate with early adopters. And the big insight from Geoffrey Moore is that the way you get to these big world-beating technologies is you leverage one type of adopter to get the other, right? So you want to start at early majority, and then you want to make their successes visible to people who are, you get your early to early majority. Right? Remember the station wagon in the driveway, right? It was visible to the other neighbors who were early majority people. They saw my problem was getting solved, right? And boom, they were there. And then you have to make the early majority customers visible to the late majority people. It's like, oh, everybody's getting station wagons, plug-in hybrid station wagon. Maybe I should get a plug-in, right? And then of course you're going to have, this person, further down, they're driving a 1942 Mercury pickup truck or something, right? And fine, over my cold dead body will ever change my car, but eventually the car will die and they'll have to get a station wagon because that's what dominates the market now, right? So if you think about any kind of personal electronic device, same story play out every time, right? There's some innovator who buys the crazy thing that's running on like the world's most rare distribution of Android, right? And it's horrible, and they spend most of their time tinkering with it. But they get no benefit, right? And then you get the early adopter who buys the thing that's slightly more polished, getting jobs done, et cetera, et cetera. So there you go. Now, how do you find early adopters? Well, I go back to that definition that Jeff Wilcox offered, right? People trying to solve the problem. And what you really want to do is you want to figure out how to identify what people do that identifies them as mistake that all the entrepreneurs make when they're starting up businesses. They come up with they identify some problem out in the world, right? It'll be some fun thing. It's like, oh, well, I'm not motivated to exercise. I'm picking on a particular business model here, right? And I think I could solve that if I linked people's exercise to charitable giving, right? And so what they'll do is they'll go out, and this happens all the time, they'll survey 1,000 people. It's like, would you be more motivated to exercise if every time you exercise a little money was going to charity? And what do people say? Of course, because I'm a good person. So they find out that 99.99% of people would be more motivated to exercise, and then they blow the money bill all possible. But people lie, right? Here's the problem is, especially where money's involved or time or commitment is involved, they will tell you that your innovation's great or the kind of value outcome you're trying to accomplish is wonderful, and of course they would. But it's much better to passively watch what they do. Be someone instead who is whatever it is, they're playing psych out music in the gym, or they are building a Google calendar that has specific times when they must work out, or they have a workout alarm, that tells me they're trying to solve the problem of exercise motivation. And those are people that I should be engaging with. Say so. So it's easy to identify behavior once you develop a kind of a knack for it, right? So lurking is always good. Asking, right? It's like, yeah, who's struggling with this problem, right? Suppose you find a new way to schedule, worked at a particle accelerator. What's the number one problem everybody has usually is beam time, right? Supposing someone figures out, okay, I've got an interesting way to basically collect way more data so that I only need minimal beam time so that everybody gets more beam time. Who are you going to engage with that concept? Struggling with the problem. Usually people who perhaps are, throwing elbows trying to get more beam time. That tells me they've got a problem and they're trying to deal with it. Qualifying surveys are okay, but usually it has to do with what people do and not with what they say. And then the other one I won't pay any huge attention to today, the idea of funnel metrics. There are ways to data that infer that people are trying to get something done. So the classic one is when you use Google AdWords to direct people who make certain kinds of queries towards certain kinds of sites. That's more of a marketing strategy than it is an early adopter strategy. But that's basically it. And the rationale for this early adopters is basically just because people usually do a poor job of saying exactly what it is they actually do. And if you can observe their behavior rather than hear what they say, you're far more likely to be dealing with their quote unquote honest selves. I want to be rude to you. For the most part, people don't want to be rude to you when you come to them with an innovative idea. They want to tell you that, oh, you're very bright, motivated, and of course it's a good idea, but that is not helpful in terms of engaging them in developing the idea into a real innovation, into a real value. So who we're looking to engage, and the MVP is how we're going to engage them. But there's a little middle layer here that I think we want to talk about, is the framework for engaging this end user. Because here's what doesn't work. What doesn't work is walking up to somebody and saying, and I've got a better idea, and if you do what I say, it's going to change your life for the better. That kind of approach, unless they're truly desperate, tends not to work. Most people like to think that they do okay in their life, right? And they're not looking to be saved by some stranger, right, who's been off their own. But they can be engaged to talk about their own problems. And I'm going to give you a way of using the idea of the value chain analysis to engage people in discussing their problems and the things they're trying to solve with you so that you can together co-invent or co-innovate. So first I want to talk about some constraints. A 30-second engineering degree here. So this is what you learn in undergraduate engineering. You learn that the world of innovation is a buffet of three things, and you can only have two. And if you think about it, any solution to any problem that you might want to really allows you to either do it cheaper and faster but at lower quality, or you can do it cheaper and better quality but you're going to spend way more time, right? Or likewise, you can do it fast at high quality but extraordinarily expensive, etc. You can choose two things out of the time, cost, quality triangle. And if you keep in mind, this is a wonderful rubric for approaching the idea of the value chain. Because if we go back to this value chain, I'm just going to break it down to a single step in the value chain of this minivan, right? So we had a minivan, and my big inspiration was I'm going to add coffee cup holders, right? Because I see the driver holding a coffee in their hand. And now I can start doing some analysis to figure out, well, is this even worth doing, right? So supposing, I would do some actual research around this, right? But let's suppose that somehow having a coffee cup holder is, because you're not fumbling around with one hand on the steering wheel and trying to use the gear shift at the same time. It's going to save something like 1.25 minutes per day over the lifetime of the coffee cup holder, which for the sake of argument we'll say is like 1,000 driving days or 5 years, right? And let's suppose that the person's time is worth $50 an hour for the sake of argument, right? And let's suppose the cost of building a coffee cup, so it's a negative value, but it's $15, right? And let's suppose that it has some influence on the experience of the quality of the vehicle overall. Let's be really outrageous and imagine that that quality experience is, well, actually not 0.01%, but let's say 1% of 30. If we did all that, we could make an argument that adding coffee cup holders has now turned this $30,000 car into a $31,290 car, for the sake of argument. And there's something called a 10x rule of innovation. This has to do with pricing power, and it says that basically when you create, say, 13 value, then maybe you can charge $130 of additional price for that value. The idea is that the customer gets 10 times as much as they give, right? Or the end user's life gets improved tenfold for every unit of value that they put in. So they put in $130 of value, they get. That's a classic idea about disruptive innovation. So that's what makes it disruptive, is 10 times better. But time, cost, quality, and the idea of breaking value chain sequences of steps that add value into their time, cost, quality parameters starts giving you a means to have some insights about people's lives, but it also gives some insights in terms of, well, what kinds of innovations are likely to yield real value. So we're going back to the idea of the canvas here. So here we are, we think we've spotted an early adopter, and we're trying to engage with them. So we've identified a problem, right? We've identified who's already trying to solve the problem. That was easy because the person who's holding their coffee cup with their hand, right, while they're driving. You can sit on a curb and identify those people, and I suppose take your license plate down and chase them down and talk to them. The next step you want to do is you want to figure out what their life looks like, right? So that is another way of that end user's value chain. What are all the things that adds up to their experience of driving down the highway with a coffee in a car? So the way you start this conversation with the end user, this person you think is going to benefit from an idea you can create for them, really has to do with, well, what their life is like, right? And what are the steps for the kinds of jobs they're trying to get done, and where the pain is. So what that looks like is you might passively observe, but you might also go talk to an early adopter, not about your, talk to them about the kinds of jobs they're trying to get done. So this is all the identifying information has been taken out, but this is an actual value chain that I had with clients who are interested in doing something in the microbrewery business, right? And so what we did is we identified someone, we thought there was a problem in sort of a customer acquisition space. These entrepreneurs out to go and talk to folks running a microbrewery, and to find out, like, okay, well, how does this business work? Right? So we lumped it into sort of like, you got to get supplies, you got to make a product. There's sales and marketing, and there's these overheads, right? Storage and cleaning and, health inspections and the rest of it. And then there's this interface with comes from the revenues they get off the customers, the margins, et cetera, et cetera. And when we had that, then we were able to say, okay, well, what in this value chain, we're talking to the microbrewer now, well, what bugs you in it, right? So where are the pain points, right? And we noticed they were doing something a little. We thought they were trying to solve a problem, and we just flat out asked them, well, what outcome do you want, right? So what have we done so far? We've basically identified a problem. There's some problem in customer acquisition, not getting the right customers. And we've identified an end user, right? The end user being the micro. We have mapped out how it is that they are doing their jobs and how they're basically making value, making money. And then we basically just simply went in and we just basically said, well, look at, why are you trying to get customers? So we've got unsold inventory. And so, you know what we did? We basically did the toddler thing. We just kept asking them why. Well, why did you? Well, okay, because we brewed too much beer. Well, why? Because we had extra kegs to fill. Well, why? Well, hops were spoiling, right? We had to use up some of our inventory. Well, why? Well, because the hops aren't storage, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And the other why was bought too many hops. And what we basically came up with is the microbrewery did not know which beers their customers would want to buy before they were brewing them. Oh, okay. So knowing that, it was very easy to say, well, here's the problem in your value. There's like this customer order information, right, and an inventory management order. And then we were basically able to say, okay, well, those steps in the value chain, all these things that have to happen, right, to get the right customer to the right beer, we think we could fix that, right? Basically say, look, we're going to modify your value chain, right? We're going to do this. We're going to collapse all those steps into a single thing, right? And if we did that, then we think it would solve your problem. And we use time, cost, quality arguments around that. And then we were able to say, okay, well, is that something that would be of interest at it? And they go, well, it certainly looks better. And because we use the time, cost, quality, we could sort of quote a price on it, right? And basically what we said is, look, if we could solve this problem for you, would you give us 25% of your revenue? And so this unsold inventory, if we can clear the unsold, can we, take 25% of the value of that sale? And so they say, yeah. And so, are you going to go back and build a software product that does this thing that you're talking about? And we said, yeah, something like that. So what we did instead is we made a minimum viable product, an MVP. The MVP is not the full form product. My clients at the time, they desperately wanted to build this really fancy software platform. It was going to be lovely, had all kinds of bells and whistles. This is what we did instead. We got them to make a list of all their buddies who liked the flavors of beer that were in an excess inventory. We got them to simulate the software they thought they were going to build on recipe cards, and then I put them on the telephone, and I had them phone all their buddies to say, look at, what kind of beer do you like, et cetera, et cetera. We went through the thing that the software was going to do, and then we basically said, look, there is a slightly discounted, right? And if you buy a keg, these are the benefits you get. So we cleared that inventory very quickly, and then we went and collected the 25%. That validated that the outcome the microbrewer wanted, right, get rid of this inventory, was worth something, right? So this assumption we'd made about fixing this value chain. What the microbrewer saw was exactly the same as if we'd accomplished this solution using fancy software. Now, there's no trickery involved in this, right? We don't tell the microbrewer we did it with fancy software. We say, no, what we did is we basically labor to simulate what the software would do, right? But you like the result? Yes, I like the result. The inventory is sold. Here's your 25%. And now I know that if I do this in software or any other method, that I can count on getting paid for it. So before I've taken the risk of investing in building some polished, validated that this end user values what I do, that the value that I create for the end user is worth something, and I know exactly what it's worth, which is very useful. The MVP is not a product. It is not a service. It's not even necessarily an innovation. And it's an experiment that tests a hypothesis you're making about the value chain, right? And how it may or may not be changed. That's sort of my definition about it. So Eric Ries and Ash Maurya, these are two leading thinkers in the world of lean startups. Eric Ries, he version of what MVP means, but he again says, its job is to teach you things about your value assumptions. And Ash Maurya, he emphasizes that, it creates value, but you also get paid. That doesn't have to be about money, right? It could be time. In the academic world, not things we're selling to people, right? It's things that we're trying to get people to invest their time and their mental energy in, right? That's the kind of value exchange that we have. So you do this job of figuring out who early adopters are, might have, and then you think about how you might be able to disrupt these value chains, right? Make some change in the state of the way they experience problems in their life. One of the nicest things you can ever accomplish in a value chain, by the way, is to eliminate parts of it. So this is pure management thinking, but eliminating steps is kind of the gold standard of innovation. If you start thinking about really disruptive, and I don't mean incremental, really disruptive innovations in the last decade, and you start scratching under, you'll notice in most cases something was eliminated, right? The electric car, which is finally after a 100-year hiatus is being repopularized, eliminates a lot of steps, right? It eliminates parts under the hood. It eliminates large parts of the fuel supply chain, right? Emissions, but that's a happy byproduct of it. You'll notice laptops, last 10 years, eliminating moving parts, right? Moving to more solid state devices. So the individual parts perhaps are slightly more sophisticated or more precise, but the actual device itself is getting simplified ultimately, right? You notice this over and over and over again. So anyway, it's just a wonderful little mental habit to shoot for, is to, rather than add things, eliminate things. So what's the difference between designing a product and designing a minimum viable product? The minimum viable product was extract information, right? It was designed to test an assumption. A product assumes that you know. So this is a classic. You'll see this in various guises all over the place. So the top row is the classic product cycle, right? So someone tells you they want to get from there fast, they want to get there with minimum physical effort, and they want to get there safely and comfortably. And then the people who hear this, the innovators, go away and they draw up the minivan, not a very nice looking minivan, but a minivan nonetheless. And they spend the $500,000 to prototype it, right? And maybe another $500,000 to get it certified, and maybe another $1 million. So they're $2 million in, and then you give it to this end user, and hopefully it creates value. In the meantime, you spent $2 million without creating any value for any end users at all. So that is a traditional so-called phase gate innovation process. And that's not the one that I teach. The one I teach is lean innovation. Lean, well, your top priority is getting from A to B, so here's a skateboard. And you would take money for the skateboard, and the customer would take the skateboard, and they'd say something probably like, well, I got from A to B, but it wasn't very fast, and I didn't feel very safe, right? And it was a lot of effort. And then I might go and say, well, here's a bicycle, right? And they'll come back, and it was a lot faster, but man, am I tired, right? And so on it goes, right? But the idea is that you're validating assumptions at every step. I could validate the A to B assumption with a skateboard. I could validate the speed assumption with a road bike. I could validate the physical effort assumption with a scooter, and then all of the assumptions with the car. So what's the advantage? Well, the advantage is, if my end user, my customer in this case, really only had truly valued getting from A to B with reasonable speed, I never would have sold them a minivan, right? Because that's a bunch of other value that isn't really motivating them. But I would have failed at scooter. But but I wouldn't be out $2 million, I'd be out several $100s, right? And this is the whole idea of running the whole process backwards, right? I'm working with this end user to develop this solution to a problem. And there are many things in the value chain of getting from A to B safely and comfortably, right, that influence that. And you have opportunities, things as you scale up through these minimum viable products, right? So minimum viable, right? So minimum is the absolute cheapest, fastest thing you can do. Viable, it has to create the value exchange that's required, right? It has to be doing something. And then product, I think I always thought was a bit of a misnomer. Maybe experiment, but that's the general idea. So again, we had this idea of the cup holders, right? The idea of a 10x rule. We know what we're shooting for in the context of just cup holders. So the minivan's been done. Let's suppose we're past that. But now the problem space, a hot beverage with me, but I really hate the hazard of spilling it on my lap, right, when I'm driving. I really hate, having only one hand to try and steer the car and then deal with the gear selector if it's a manual car. And then I can intervene in that value chain. So in order to make the minimum viable product work, there's a few different things we have to touch on in this. So the solution, this number 4 area, is not really exactly what we have to have, but we do have to validate this idea that there's a problem and a solution that go together. And really to do is we have to basically validate this value proposition. If you go back to the materials in the lean canvas, the problem is easy, that's the problem. The solution is also easy, that's the solution. The unique value proposition basically says, what is it about the solution that is better than the alternative, right? That's the hypothesis you're trying to connect. That channels is how do you reach an end user, right? So how do you engage with them? At the early stages, it's usually just a conversation. It's like, hey, I saw you trying to solve a problem. Would you like to talk to me? Sometimes it's a bit more sophisticated than that. The end user has to do with these segments, and these segments have to do with, are they an early adopter, late adopter? We want early adopters in here. That's all we care about, and how we reach them is important. And then revenue stream really just is, okay, in order to get this value using some solution, are they willing to part with either time or money? Is usually the case.
And we have a question from the audience.
Yeah,
thanks, Connor. If your idea is innovative, isn't there a concern that the idea gets out while you're doing this testing and someone else may beat you to the market?
Yeah, it's always a concern, but in practice, this is always slightly facetious, Connor, but I always give this example. If I had a smartphone hologram off of it, right, and that was something I built in the garage, and if I went walking through Apple headquarters, having a conversation with little Emperor Palpatine on my holographic cell phone, odds are I'd just be ignored. So this is a little facetious, right? But the truth of the matter is, competitors in most innovative fields, if they're established competitors, odds are they are already fully invested and fully involved with what they're already delivering. So the odds that they're going to pay huge attention to what you're doing are relatively low. Now that's slightly facetious, and we know full well hacked and stolen all the time. One of the glories of this is the don't worry, be happy answer, but let me give you a more responsible answer. The minimum viable product usually, at least at the early stages, is usually so far removed from the product itself. What you're trying to do is you're trying to accomplish the valued outcome that the end user would pay for. And usually the smartest way you can deliver that value is something other than the product that you have in mind. Usually it boils down to, I think you'll see it in another slide, it usually boils down to manual recipe cards. You can imagine if someone's calendar data was a problem for them, right? And there was a little middle software layer you could write that would solve that for them. But before you invested that effort, you might just simply engage. If your calendar only presented things that were in your top 10 relevant things at the beginning of the day, and then gave you like a gentle reminder for things that are in the top third, is that something you would pay for? And they say yes. Then the way I'd probably implement it is I'd probably just get a copy of their calendar and give them little, text messages through the day, right, to deliver that collected payment for them. Okay, then maybe it's, and I know there's enough people who would do similar. That's when I might actually build the product. So yeah, intellectual property leakage is always a bit of a challenge. Interestingly enough, most innovation is not product innovation. Most innovation is not entrepreneurship. Most innovation is processes developed by intrapreneurs inside institutions. So I'll give you a really another facile example. So using Excel in corporations have probably created, I'm guessing, probably about $10 trillion worth of innovation over the last couple of decades. Now, we're never going to celebrate that. And there's certainly no really inheritable intellectual property to be seized out there. But economic impact of people solving problems by using knowledge in ways that create value that was not previously possible. Yeah, you start thinking about dumb things like Excel, people who have at home and solve weird little household problems probably create $10 to $100 billion of innovation every given year, assuming things get shared, right? Things can scale up. So the idea that the product is the end-all, be-all, and that the product is always going to be subject to up in. And as researchers, I always like to think of privileging processes over products as my innovation target, just because I know it's going to be processes that probably have the biggest and most disruptive impacts on research. Now, every once in a while, we get to prototype a new, and that's awesome, because that allows us to be inventors, and that really is a product, if you will, right? And then the way we use it has a lot to do with what value it creates. So, sorry, a bit of a tangent. So yeah, be a little bit careful out there if you've really got something. If you're really concerned, though, what you want institution, you want to talk to your technology transfer office, right? And you can protect your ideas pretty easily, right? A professor not too far away did very well inventing a really interesting compound that was used in electronics, and took the very modest effort technology transfer office protect it. A rather large multinational went and used it without permission, and then sued and got a really wonderful license check out of the deal. So there's an opportunity to profit from your inventiveness without doing much work at all, right? I mean, I prefer obviously not to do well that way. Sorry,
there's a follow-up for Connor. He was just wondering if you'd suggest getting everyone involved to sign contracts or NDAs.
For the most part,
I believe that's a facetious comment, Jennifer. He's laughing at the end of it.
Yeah. No, yeah. Hey, don't mock the NDA too much. So I have signed probably into the low thousands of NDAs signed. Yeah, in certain spaces, you're going to need that, right? If the idea can be appropriated and copied at will, then yeah, an NDA is going to be important. And the more innovation work you do, the more. Don't be too dismissive of the NDA, but no, for the most part, you're not going to need that. To stretch someone's face into a smile, no NDA required. Or maybe they shouldn't tell anybody that you actually did that. So. What does this microbrewery thing look like in terms of the lean model canvas? Well, we identified a unique value proposition thing. We used conversations, right, to reach this early adopter. This was the person, right, the brewer with. This was the problem, unsold beer varieties. There was an offer made here, which is sort of between this end user, this channel, and this idea of revenue stream. It was 10% of gross sales is what we negotiated, right? And then we basically did a solution, right? And that was our MVP, was call friends who like the varieties of beers that were for sale and drive the sales, right? That was what we did rather than doing the software product. So the MVP usually is going to be, not very flashy, right? The first MVP is usually going to be, but it's going to give us a heck of a lot of useful information. As we do the solution, of course, what we're really after is learning. And here's the thing we found out. Well, we found out that it took 25 minutes per sale, and that the value back to our entrepreneurs was $14. It's not great as a sustainable business model. That was a pretty low margin. We found out that the special sessional brews were easier to move. And people who had very specific flavors or product that they liked were a little harder to move, right? To go and get that stuff, and that is what gives you the picture. So we actually dropped this opportunity, right? Because what we learned is, yes, even though we would be paid handsomely to solve this problem, the amount of cost of engaging another buyer, this third party, to act we were doing was going to not generate enough revenue per person to make it worthwhile. So it was fantastic. So here's the beauty. We failed, and we failed quickly. And that's really what innovation's about. It's about finding your path to failure as quickly and cheaply as possible before you've invested huge amounts of time and effort in pan out necessarily. But we did realize that because we did realize that because these microbrews would pay out to solve certain kinds of inventory problem, that we could offer other kinds of inventory management product, and that's basically where that business wound up going. So, so that's the idea. It sits in this build, measure, learn loop, right? So this is the lean startup cycle, typically. You build an experiment, which basically manifests as this minimum viable product. You run it, you learn some things, right? Right, you get your learning, and then you take the insights from that learning, right? And then you will simply iterate it again. So I think I made the point that MVPs are not necessarily products. In the startup world, you tend to hear terms like, simulated glued to X. So glued to X is when you take an existing product and you may modify it some way, you may hack it some way. That's a very common way to run an MVP. Concierge is basically when you hire somebody to do whatever physical labor is required to receive the value outcome. The Wizard of Oz, or often called the man or woman behind the curtain, is basically the idea that you take a job, end user, you go off and you solve it manually, and then you present it back to them as a finished thing. You often do that rather than write software the first time. Cardboard, same idea, right? The idea that you can build a mock-up that gets something done. The early alpha, right? So the software product that is so bad, it's basically just an Excel table version of this kind of an MVP. And then, of course, you may have an actual product, right? Or an actual process or an actual service, which is just sort of an early beta, right? That's also can be an MVP if it's still feeding that kind of learning about value chains. So I think that's kind of a poll question. I want to talk about a few innovation problem spaces that we tend to see in research. So the key takeaway here is innovation requires end users. And until you have an end user accomplishing value, some change in their value, innovation. It might be an invention, right? If it's something truly novel, it might just be an idea. But what makes it an innovation is that the end user is benefiting. I'm going to very quickly cycle through the parts of the canvas that are pertinent here. And the difference between an MVP is the MVP is there to validate that the problem and the solution and the end user or customer and that the revenue model and that the value proposition and the solution, they all work together, right? The product's job is to do all of that sustainably, right? So I'll get to that, but that's really what products do. Products allow us to create value over and over and over again for as many people as we want without causing us to go bankrupt. That's really what the product is. There is no product in the world that is perfectly, infinitely scalable, but there's quite a few that are. So we're trying to validate that the end user's desired outcome can be accomplished, right? And that it's valuable, that the way it's accomplished has value for the end user. And then the other thing is this idea of sustainment, right? So sort of fun little mental model of the person trying to change from a frowny face to a smiley face. And yes, my first offer with them as an MVP may well have been to stretch their face into a smile, which is awful, and maybe it's worth only a nickel. But maybe I do have a longer term vision, right? Because I know I can't do that for everybody without going bankrupt. If I were to work with a physiotherapist and develop a face exercise video that helps tone someone's face so they have a natural resting smile on their face, that might be a real product, right? And the art of innovation usually is moving between these cycles of minimum viable products to help accept hypotheses about value creation for end users, right? All that really uncertain stuff. And then I'm moving towards a scalable and sustainable product that can be delivered to many people, right? Which is the far more certain stuff. So that's really what happens when we're using value chains to identify that value creation process and then move towards some sustainable, scalable solution. That's really the art of it. Most innovators do have an end game in mind, and you don't do it completely blindly. So just to review.
Do we have a moment for a question, or would you like to do a review and then open it?
No, I can take a question.
Connor has another one. To test out MVPs on friends that you know would like the product. I imagine finding customers is a significant aspect of the process, and your list of friends will run out fast. Or is finding customers considered a problem for later?
Yeah. Almost never your friends. Almost never. Because your friends, they're all going to lie to you. They love you, man. And they're not going to tell you that your idea is horrible because they're your friends. And what you need is a really honest engagement with, a customer, someone whose sole focus is the value that they're getting out of it. I know of no innovator or entrepreneur who hasn't tested every idea out on their friends and family. It just happens naturally. So here's what I suggest. Go ahead and do it because that's fun, but then discard that information and try to go find that arm's length customer who's going to give you the straight dope about you're creating real value for them. And the other part of that conversation, because I've always been a table pounder about this, is you got to take the customer's money. And by money, I mean they have to give you something that they care about to engage with this. Sometimes it's just their time, sometimes in kind, but in practice, nothing works quite as well as just taking cash. Your MVP is usually not awesome. Usually the experience of using the MVP or getting value from the MVP is somewhat flawed, so you're not going to be charging them a lot. And part of the art is figuring out, well, what should that limit be in order to make sure that I'm properly controlling this experiment and getting valid feedback, right? So, stretching this poor person's face into a smile, if I'm asking for more than a nickel for that, I'm probably overcooking it because it's a pretty miserable experience. But if I get the nickel, I know they're willing to give me something, right? And, and I'm thinking about the $14.99, face exercise video series that they can subscribe to online. That's my long-term game plan, but I gotta work out these customer value assumptions first. So whether it's a process that you would like to implement in a laboratory, or it's a service that you think people like your friends and family would benefit from, or it's a product that you think you could sell to the whole world, it all begins with talking with those arm's length end users and trying to create the value product, service, or process would create. Yeah. So, and I'm sorry, you have to talk to strangers, and some of them are just going to be mean to you too. That's also part of it. And, but you'll be interesting, if you use things like value chain analysis and you really are getting people to talk about their own problems, you're going to find people are very, anybody who's interested in their problems. Or put it this way, if you go to a bar and your first words to any random stranger you bump into is, tell me all about yourself and your problems, that's often exactly what people want to hear right? In a conversation. If you can get someone talking about their own problems, a gold mine of information about how to create value for them. So there we go. Okay. So I'm going to open up the conversation. I just want to quickly review what this all looks like in terms of the lean model canvas. So we talked about identifying an early adopter. That really is confronting, is there a problem and who has it? Who are these segments, right? And, because it's early adopter, who's already trying to solve the problem, right? That's absolutely key, right? The station wagon buyer in the neighborhood, how did the car company identify them probably because they were trying to stuff cargo into a smaller hatchback, right? If cargo was the concern, right? If the plug-in electric hybrid was the sales proposition that was motivating them, then they were probably hypermiling, right? So hypermiling is all the little tricks, driving habits to extend your gas mileage. And by the way, car companies pay a lot of attention to people who are online sharing hypermiling tricks, because they know those are the people they want to sell hybrid and electric vehicles to. The second stage is the offer. So this all flows from the Justin Wilcox program steps. So the first is find early adopters. Second is offer to help, right? Offer to help has to do with what do they want to accomplish? What do they value as an outcome? And then how do you reach them, right? The next is the currency test, right? And that's basically just, will you pay me to solve your problem, right? Can I get a nickel if I stretch your face into a smile? All that is a simple control in your MVP experiment, just to make sure that the experiment is properly controlled. Because what happens for free doesn't get attached to realizing value, right? So anything, people say, yeah, I'll try your product for free. That's that innovator person, right? Option curve, they're useless to you, right? Because free means it's not part of their value chain, which means there's no valuable information back. And then, of course, value. Is value created, right? And then we can move on into questions of sustainability, right? So, can we deliver the value? And then can we do better the next time we try, right? Can we move from the unsustainable face stretching to the sustainable face exercise video?
We have a question in the audience, Ed.
Yeah.
Dr. Susan says, if we want to test the MVP with, let's say, hotels or hospitals, etc., how can we initiate the process to meet with them and attract their attention and let them deal with us seriously? So I guess this is a question around, identifying and getting your potential customer to meet with you.
Yeah. So this really sounds a lot like a pandemic response innovation. So I'm intrigued already. The best thing you can do is to figure out who's already trying to solve the problem. So I'll give you another example. It's another client case. we had a client actually came out of Queens campus some years ago, and they had identified that cell phones are and cleaning them is a bit of a pain, especially in places where dirty cell phones might be some sort of a transmission vector for disease or other kinds of contamination. So they went and they developed, they identified the problem, and then they identified a sterilization kit for cell phones. Pretty cool. They had a real struggle in finding customers, and what they found out is all they had to do is look for the hospitals that had a please don't use your cell phone, not because of radio interference, but because of, like, there'd be a sanitation message about cell phone, or if the hospital, this is before long, or if the hospital had basically like hung out courtesy sterilizing wipes for cell phones, they identified that, okay, so this organization is already trying to solve the problem. So the best way you can make the approach, the one that's going to yield you the most traction for the least effort, is to pre-screen those hotels and hospitals trying to solve the kind of problem you're addressing. Ideally now you're going to solve it better than the way they are already trying. So yeah, who's struggling, right? And struggling is not just passively suffering. Struggling is trying to do something about it, but failing for whatever reason. And letters are awesome for that, right? So you can find a problem space. You go look through the industry newsletter, and some regional manager of some hotel is talking about some sort of a cleaning cleaning solution that they're using, or cleaning process they're using. They're trying to solve a kind of problem, and if your idea is perfect, then you need to call them. And the way you do this is you use this value chain structure. You say, hey, I saw you were trying to solve your problem, and I know that in your world, turning over rooms quickly is important for you to manage your profit margins, right? And that the available room you have, budget-wise, is really low, right? So I know this about your value world. I would love to talk to you about how we can maybe change, maybe the time, frequency, cycle of cleaning, or whatever it is, to see if we can really address the problem, right? Because this is what I'm focused on. I've got a few ideas, and that will get you right. Randomly knocking on hotel doors or randomly calling hospitals is not the way to do it, because remember that distribution? Only 13.5% of people are early adopters. Now, in an institution like a hospital or a hotel, only 13.5% of the personnel in those institutions are early adopters. Of that 13.5%, it's probably going to be something in the order of maybe 1% that actually have decision-making authority, right? So you really have to figure out how to reach the right kind of people. They need enough authority to allow you to engage with them, right? But they also have the problem. So it usually winds up being a lot of phone calls, right? To find out who, I saw you had these disinfecting wipes hung on the wall. I too, right, do work in device disinfection in healthcare settings, right? I would love to talk to the person who was in charge of getting this. Who recharges those things? Who approved the budget? And that's exactly what happened with this company that made this phone disinfection. And it turns out that hospitals became the initial customer segment for this product, right? But it was interesting. You couldn't sell it to just any hospital. It had to be a hospital that had a ward manager who cared about disinfecting phones. But, a pretty successful little company, right? And, so yeah, it's you qualify these conversations. All good. Excellent. So I think I was going to move into just a very quick idea of what sustainment looks like. So this is so key metrics they're not really an experiment. They show up on a lean model canvas, but what kind of data would you need to have to know that you are reliably creating this value and that it's all sustainable? Unfair advantage and cost structure, though, are exquisitely tied to this idea of and scalable solutions. I could physically stretch someone's face into a smile, but I know I can only do that for one person at a time. And because they're only paying me $0.05 per day, it's not really, the cost structure is not great there, right? My labor is worth more than that, so I'm going to go bankrupt if I do that. I need to work towards something that has a cost structure advantage. So something that is unique about the value cost, so the time cost quality triangle. The things I'm delivering in that triangle need to be unique enough so that competitors can't just immediately mimic what I'm doing, right? So intellectual property is a classic unfair advantage, right? Sometimes just is an unfair advantage. There's a number of ways to do it, but you need those things to really do something sustainably and scalably. Now, in research, we're usually just trying to disrupt the value proposition, the value chain. So the unfair advantage maybe isn't so important to our ability to sustain. I will tell you from my experience in physical chemistry, though, what happens is you invent a new experimental process, some apparatus, and then your unfair advantage usually becomes that your lab is the only one that can really generate the beautiful results because you understand all the intricacies of using the equipment and what it's quirks, right, of running the particular gear in question. Sometimes, the apparatus is unique in all the world. That's an unfair advantage. So you tend to get those things sometimes not even by trying. But that's the ultimate game plan. But at this point, these number 5 questions, you're past the minimum viable product, right? This is moving into products, services, or software, right? So I thought I would just launch a very quick poll question. And how much time do I have, Alex? I have another 15 minutes? So I'm going to use the answer to the question just to motivate a little follow-up conversation is all. Yeah. So yeah, I love that. So, there's like a journal question. I don't know what that is. Okay, I'm shutting that down. But so what's bugging people the most, right, is coordinating and collaborating, right, with multiple people. And then the other thing is, the focused time. Mm-hmm. And I ask these questions because I guess I wanted to cause you all to lose a little bit of sleep, but just to think about how would you innovate to address those kinds of problems that have, negative impacts on our research life. It's been interesting in the last being forced to work remotely. At the McDonald Institute, Snow Lab, Triumph, Chalk River, there's been quite a few people involved in building ventilators with the MVM group out of Milan. That's really complicated work. There's huge amounts of regulatory effort. It's been really cool to build new tools and new processes for managing collaborative work just to deal with that. And, we're caught up in building this, so it's a mechanical ventilator to assist stricken COVID patients with breathing. It's meant to provide like the 2 core modes, so it's not a radically complicated version of a ventilator. The idea is to keep it fairly straightforward. It's still fairly complicated because it's sophisticated in terms of how you manage the pressure regulation of the inhale-exhale. And it's expensive, right? You got to build these things. We're trying to do something that can respond to the emergency. That is going to be recognized as innovation out of the gate. And it is innovation because what it's doing is delivering this thing at a certain cost, which makes it available in ways it might not otherwise be. But then there's all this other innovation that happens around actually getting that job done, right? Hands up, how many people use overleaf? I'll just shut down the screen share. Yeah, I don't see a lot of, okay, yeah. So Overleaf is this wonderful software innovation response to the problem of collaboration in science, right? It's almost, well, there's a number of humanities folks, right? But use LaTeX for anything, right? That's pretty much it, right? And for the longest time, using LaTeX was just brutal because only one person could be editing document at a time. So when I came up through grad school, what it was, you bounce this document in email forever, right? And you wait for somebody to make their changes. So Overleaf does away with that, right? You can now collaborate, LaTeX document in real time. It also solves a lot of the other LaTeX learning hurdles in that it provides you some nice templates, right? That allows you to just get to work. You know, the other piece, this idea of having the ability to focus on things, right, and get protected time, that's one where I haven't seen a huge amount of innovation, right? And I opportunity in research. You know, it's, you know, I asked the question just because innovation is just about solving problems ultimately, right? And the problems don't have to be solved with a product. Just figuring out a new way of doing things can be really, really useful, right? The fractured time, this was a humanities professor who said it a few days ago, right? What makes a professor successful is the ability to switch what they're doing with no notice at all. And if you can't do that, you won't survive in academia, right? So, but I was thinking, you know, there are probably ways of doing things, ways of setting up processes that wouldn't necessitate you're not constantly being distracted. We're starting to see some software products, right, that do certain things like blacking out other screens, right, and sort of trying to force focus. Desk arrangements could be an interesting innovation, right, to help force focus. I always thought it'd be very interesting to simply have balance in every office, right, where someone could literally sit down and just read, you know, or write, as the case may be. You know, you'd have a Faraday cage, so no phone signal could get to you, whatever it is. You know, some assumptions there that need to be tested. But I wanted to ask the question to sort of trigger your thinking about how gets done in order to create more value, right? Or eliminate value destroying steps for people. So I'm kind of pleased you guys chose those particular items. Nobody, I don't think anyone actually picked acquiring skills or knowledge, which is interesting because the way is we tend to make that the emphasis, right? We tend to think that's the hurdle to getting research done. Yeah, you need it, but it turns out that that value chain is not causing us our problems, right? Our problems have to do with just simply having space to do things and then coordinating through all the chaos to get things done, especially in, you know, big projects where things get done en masse.